This is a review of critical thinking for Management 112, Organizational Behavior. Before we get into what critical thinking is, we should take a look at a couple of examples of why it might be useful. So consider the following headline: Congress failed to pass the bill. Congress, being the legislative body of the United States federal government consisting of the House and the Senate, their job is to look at bills, potential laws, and either vote to pass them or vote not to pass them. That headline states that Congress failed to pass the bill. What if the same headline was rewritten slightly? Congress successfully defeated the bill. How are those two headlines different? In the first instance, the person writing the headline is telling you that the bill did not pass, and they're blaming Congress for it by saying that they failed. In the second headline, the outcome is the same, whether the bill was defeated or it failed to pass. The bill did not pass, but the other headline, the second headline, is defining it as Congress successfully defeating the bill. You could imagine the first headline was written by someone that wanted the bill to pass and is now blaming Congress for not doing so. The second headline could be written by someone who is opposed to the bill, and they are congratulating Congress for doing so. However, the news is supposed to simply tell you information, and it's up to you to determine whether or not passage of the bill was a good thing or a bad thing. You don't need someone to tell you whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. This is a very basic part of critical thinking. Whenever you see information that is presented to you that seems to be colored in favor of one perspective instead of another, you may want to be careful about the information that you're looking at, aside from even determining whether or not it's accurate. The fact is it can really start to influence the way that you think about something, the way the information is presented to you. Schools typically tell you what you're supposed to know. We're going to be doing that a bit during this semester as well. But critical thinking isn't just regurgitating what you're told to remember. It's not knowing what to think or what to know, it's how to think. So if you use critical thinking, you'll be able to look at the benefits and the weaknesses of information. You can examine assumptions. An assumption is when information is presumed to be true, but does not have actual proof that it is true. Sometimes assumptions are important. For example, if I have to do a budget for next year, I don't know how much money I'm going to have. Although in the middle of a pandemic, it's likely I'm going to have a lot less than I thought. However, I need to make some assumptions. If we think that the money coming in this year is going to be similar to the money that we had coming in last year, I can extrapolate that out and come up with a reasonable assumption. However, if I just pick a number out of the blue and say that that's how much money is going to be in my budget, the assumption that I'm making isn't really based on anything. When someone tells you information and they are presenting it as a fact, it's important to understand whether it is a fact or an assumption. And if it is an assumption, on what basis was that assumption created? Was it created on good information and it's a reasonable extrapolation of what could happen in the future in the case of a budget? Or is it actually just a guess? Critical thinking can also help expose biases. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but everybody has some level of bias to some degree, whether it's against or in favor of certain people, or against or in favor of certain things that you wish to be true that may or may not be. Critical thinking will help you weigh evidence and assess the conclusions that are made on the basis of that evidence in order to come forward to a good decision. The term critical thinking has the word critical right in it, but that does not mean criticism. Critical simply means that you are not making a decision on the basis of faith or trust. You are actually looking for proof before you make a decision. Skepticism is also viewed as being relatively negative, but it's good to have a healthy level of skepticism. When someone's telling you something, you don't necessarily want to take it at face value unless there's enough supporting information to let you know that it is probably going to be accurate. So you want to have an open mind about things. You shouldn't doubt everything regardless of the evidence presented to you. But you also shouldn't believe anything simply because someone told you that it's true. You have to go through a process to determine whether the information you're looking at is valid. Critical thinking simply requires proof before you accept something. Some of the things that you should do when you're employing critical thinking skills: try to avoid a negative focus. You shouldn't always focus on what is wrong. You should also focus on what is right. You don't have to be excessively risk and loss averse. What risk is a possibility of something going bad. In business, a risk means that you could be putting up money in an investment and end up losing it. That's also a loss. So if you're risk and loss averse, you will never take any chances. The basics behind business is that you're putting some capital up front in order to make money, to make a return on your investment or an ROI. If you are completely risk and loss averse, you're probably not going to go very far in business because you really need to put something at stake in order to gain a benefit. There are basically four things you can do with risk. You can accept it, you can avoid it, you can mitigate it, or you can pass it on to someone else. If you accept the risk, let's say I'm going to drive to work, there is a statistical possibility that I could be killed driving to work. However, that statistical possibility is quite low, and I have to weigh the benefit, which is going to work and making a paycheck, versus the risk, which is getting into a car accident and suffering some type of loss. Most people will just accept that particular risk. I could avoid the risk, meaning that I don't want to do anything that would put myself at risk, so instead of getting in my car and driving to work, I just stay in bed. I could mitigate the risk, which means I could drive safely, I could wear a seatbelt, I could do the speed limit, I could drive defensively, etc. I could also pass that risk of loss onto someone else by a contract, which is known as insurance. So rather than taking the loss of the car or even my life, you could insure either, what you could do is pay a third party to do some mathematical wizardry, come up with the potential loss. They will charge you a fee known as a premium, and then you will pay the insurance, and then if you suffer a loss, they will pay to make you whole. And if you don't suffer a loss, they keep your money. But the idea behind insurance is that you would pay a little bit to get rid of that risk or to shift it to someone else so that you don't have to bear the entire amount. And the cost of the premium hopefully is low enough so that it is something that you can afford to do. The best insurance is the type of insurance where you couldn't afford not to have it. If you have homeowners insurance on a house that's worth $500,000 and you have to pay $1,500 a year, it makes sense to make that payment because losing a $500,000 house would be something that most people could not overcome. One of the things that would help you understand what critical thinking is to look at what irrational or non-critical thinking is. In 1976, NASA sent the Viking orbiter to Mars and took some of the best pictures at the time of what Mars looked like. The camera at the time was not particularly sophisticated, and the picture that you're seeing right now was sent back from the orbiter, and it was published in the newspapers. And some people looked at it and said, oh, look, it looks like a face. NASA never said it was a face. They said, hey, if you look at it, if the light is right, maybe it kind of looks like a face. They just basically said it was the environment of Mars. Some took a look at that picture and thought that it was created by intelligent life. They started referring to it as the face on Mars. Other people thought that it was simply a natural phenomenon. The picture that you see here is the old man on the mountain in New Hampshire, which, ironically enough, isn't there anymore. It fell. But that was a natural outcropping, and if you looked at it from the profile, some people thought it looked like an old man. In fact, if you look at the New Hampshire license plates, they're green, and there's an image of the old man on the mountain behind it. It was kind of the state symbol. It did unfortunately collapse, so if you go there looking for the old man on the mountain, you'll just find a pile of rocks at the bottom of a hill. This man is named Richard Hoagland. He claims that the face on Mars, or the picture that NASA took, does in fact depict an artificial structure that was intentionally built to resemble a face. He claims that the United States has knowledge of aliens, extraterrestrials, living on the Mars and on the moon of Earth. The face is part of the ruins of an ancient Martian city. The Martians must have escaped Mars because their atmosphere isn't there anymore, and he had to figure out where would they have gone. So his conclusion is that the human population of Earth came from Mars. He doesn't really explain how we forgot how to do space travel because we haven't actually been back to Mars yet. But apparently this civilization was so sophisticated that they were able to build things on Mars and come to Earth and populate Earth. How did we get there? Well, here's a picture from maybe about 15 years ago. It's from the European Space Agency, and they took a picture of the same part of Mars with much better definition and from a slightly different angle. You may think that it looks like a face. To me, it looks like a hill or a mountain. I suppose if you could imagine going over the top of it and the light being just right, it could look like a face. But now that we've seen it, I wouldn't imagine most people would think that it was created by intelligent life, particularly intelligent life that came to Earth. Regardless of that, I went to Amazon a few years ago and I typed the face on Mars and I got over 2,700 hits. There were books, there are videos, there are all types of things that you can buy. And if you look at the last one on this image, it says Monuments of Mars, a City on the Edge of Forever. And that is by Richard Hoagland. So this is the same person who who was on that TV show. He's making money selling these books. It seems to be clear that the face on Mars is not a face, but 2,700 books out there, people must be buying them. But why are they buying them? Well, the argument could be that they're using irrational thinking. So irrational is basically poor thinking. You're not using reasonable or rational thought or logic. If you believe without proof, if you make snap decisions without really paying attention to the context of the decision that you're making, if you develop only one or two potential alternatives that could be what is causing some type of an issue, you may be putting yourself in a box. Some people make the facts fit the argument instead of looking at the facts and coming to a conclusion. A lot of people see that picture and think, wow, it looks like a face on Mars. I want it to be a face on Mars. So then they only look at the information that supports that argument and they ignore all the information that would otherwise discredit that argument. They focus on what at the expense of why. They don't really, they just look at what it looks like instead of why it might look that way. When you ask questions about why, you start to get more details and you could really come to a better conclusion. The last one is intellectual dishonesty. People could just lie to you. The person who wrote that book, The Face on Mars, A City on the Edge of Forever, he may not actually believe that it is a face that was designed by intelligent life, but he knows he can sell a lot of books by selling it to people who don't do any of the critical thinking steps that we're going to be reviewing later on. So the critical thinking tools that we should be using, it's all premised on logic. And logic is simply a method of reasoning or argumentation. It helps you determine how accurate information is. And if the information that you have is accurate and you review it correctly, you can make good decisions on the basis of that information. In logic, an argument is not a fight. You're not literally arguing with someone. It is simply a premise followed by a conclusion. It could be a number of premises or it could just be one. There's a picture of Nikita Khrushchev who's supposedly arguing, taking his shoe off and banging it on the podium. Since this is a critical thinking segment of the class, I should point out that that picture appears to be photoshopped because there's never really been any evidence that he did that. There's a rumor that he did it, but there's really no clear evidence that he took his shoe off and kind of freaked out. So let's take a look at an argument. Here's a premise. If I do not eat lunch, I will be hungry. That's a premise. And I think most people, if you skip lunch, you probably would be hungry, so that seems to be a valid premise. Lunch is served at noon. We can assume that that's just a fact. If I do not eat at noon, I will be hungry. On the basis of these two premises, you can draw that conclusion. If I don't eat lunch, I'm going to be hungry. Lunch is served at noon. What should I do? I better eat lunch at noon. So a lot of decisions are justified by those arguments. That is exactly what you will do. When lunch is served, you will eat, otherwise you'll be hungry. Pretty simple. Where people go astray is with logical fallacies. A fallacy is a defect or an inherent falsehood in the structure of an argument that leads your mind away from the truth and the facts of what's going on and can lead to an erroneous conclusion. It's basically a fake argument or a counterfeit argument. One of the logical fallacies, and there are literally hundreds if you look them up on YouTube or Google, a non sequitur, which is Latin for it does not follow. It's based on the word that is built around sequence. Non sequitur means it does not follow. That means the conclusion that you're stating does not follow from the premise. It's basically a misapplication of logic. So let me give you another example. Here's a premise. If you are human, you are a mammal. That is true. You are human. That is also true. The conclusion that you can draw from that is you are a mammal. That is not fallacious. That is not a logical fallacy. That is a premise, a second premise, and a conclusion that all matches up. However, here's a premise. All humans are mammals. All pigs are mammals. The conclusion is that all humans are pigs. Now, it looks like it's the same argument, but if you think back to what we said before, the question was you are a human, or the statement was that you are a human and you are a mammal. Therefore, if you are human, you are a mammal, and you are human. The pool of potential people that we're looking at, or groups that we're looking at, is just you. When we talk about all humans being mammals and all pigs are being mammals, if you created a Venn diagram, there'd be some crossover there. The argument is a little bit different because the structure is different, and that can lead to an erroneous conclusion. In this case, all humans are not pigs. At least, I don't think most of them are. But that would be a non sequitur because it does not follow. Another thing that leads to logical fallacies is causation. I have a link in your syllabus. You should pause this video now and watch the Bear Patrol video from your syllabus and then come back here. So causation is basically the premise of cause and effect. Correlation is when two things, which are basically different, but they are associated, they occur at the same time, or they occur in a way that it appears that they are happening simultaneously or closely together. That is a correlation. When two things happen at the same time and they are unrelated, but they both happen, they are correlated. Causation is an act which produces an effect. So you may see a flash of lightning and you may hear thunder. That is a correlation. Every time you see a flash, you may hear thunder. However, you cannot presume simply because those two things are correlated that lightning is causing the thunder. You have to actually do some experimentation, and of course, lightning does cause thunder if you're close enough to hear it. So the classic line in critical thinking from this is that while correlation is important, it does not imply causation. Just two things being correlated does not mean that one is causing the other. If a black cat walks in front of you and you have bad luck, those two things are correlated, the cat and your bad luck. But that doesn't mean that the cat caused the bad luck. You would need to actually get proof of that. So causation cannot be proven by correlation alone. And if you watch that Bear Patrol video, you will see that Homer is basically incapable of distinguishing between correlation and causation. The fact that Lisa had a rock and there were no tigers around doesn't mean that the rock was preventing tigers from coming. The appeal to ignorance is a logical fallacy, which basically is someone arguing that something is true because you cannot prove it to be false, or something is false because you cannot prove it to be true. Now, if anyone is making any kind of a claim, the burden is on them to prove it. If someone says something that sounds crazy, and then you ask them about it and they say, prove it's false, that's not how logic works. That is an appeal to ignorance. They are making you assume that something is true because you can't prove it. It's very hard to prove a negative, by the way. It's impossible to prove a negative. If somebody is making a claim, it is up to them to prove and provide proof that it is true. So here's an example. No one can prove that John was murdered. The conclusion, the fallacious conclusion, is that John was not murdered. However, just because you can't prove that John wasn't murdered doesn't mean that he wasn't murdered. It could mean that he was murdered by someone who was pretty good at hiding his evidence. Somebody could get away with murder. That doesn't mean that John was not murdered. It can happen either way as well. So you could say no one has been able to disprove that he was murdered, therefore he was murdered. You could say that no one has been able to prove that he was murdered, therefore he was not. The only thing that can prove that he was murdered is proof that he was murdered, not the appeal to ignorance. This has happened in public in, the Salem witch trials, and the book by Arthur Miller called The Crucible that some of you may still have to read in high school was based a lot on the appeal to ignorance. And here's a quote from the congressional record by a United States senator said this. Joseph McCarthy was searching for communists, and he held a bunch of hearings, and someone asked him, does someone have communist connections? Is this person a communist? And McCarthy's answer was, and I quote, I do not have much information on this except the general statement in the agency that there's nothing in the files to disprove his communist connections. So the head of this investigation, when trying to prove that someone is a communist, his best argument was there's nothing to prove that he's not. And again, that is not how it works. If you want to prove that someone is a communist, which is not illegal, by the way, If you want to prove that someone is a communist, you have to have proof that he's a communist. You can't just say, well, we don't have anything that says that he's not. The slippery slope is a pretty common logical fallacy. It's when people say, if we do this, then all these other things are going to happen, and they're almost always bad. The example would be, if we don't enforce the parking laws, people will think it's all right to violate every other law in the books, and then, there'll be rape and murder and chaos. Probably what's going to happen is if you don't enforce the parking laws, a lot of people will park illegally. There's really no evidence that all this other stuff would happen, and you'd have to have proof that all those things would happen. You can't just say, because if we don't do this one thing, there's going to be this domino effect, and all these other things will happen. You will notice that it almost never is used in the opposite. It's always, if we let this happen, all these terrible things are going to happen. They never make the slippery slope argument to something appealing. So, for example, if you murder someone, then the next thing is you want to commit a robbery, and then an assault, and then a jaywalking, and before you know it, you'll be nominated from sainthood. They never look at the bad to the good. They always look at the good to the bad. The slippery slope is a fallacy because every step of everything that you said is going to go wrong has to have its own independent proof. A false dilemma is basically an either-or premise. Someone who says you're either with us or you're against us, that's a false dilemma. It's false because just because I'm not in agreement with you doesn't mean that I'm against you. I may not care, frankly. There could be a spectrum of maybe 10,000 degrees of where I fall between two different positions. And to put them into a black or white thinking, which is what this is also called, it's either this or that, when there could be multiple other potential positions. That is a fallacy, and it's usually used by people to manipulate you to agreeing with them. Hasty generalization. I'm left-handed. About 10% of the world is left-handed. I think males are about 12%, women are about 6 or 7%. So a hasty generalization is when you generalize. You put people, when you only know a few, into a particular bucket, and you kind of draw that correlation from a limited circumstance that you've had limited experience, and you make a generalization on the basis of that limited information. So Bill and Charles are left-handed. Bill and Charles also happen to be lazy, in my estimation. Therefore, all left-handed people are lazy. Now, if 10% of America is left-handed, that means there's more than 32 million people that are left-handed. Because these two people are lazy, it's unlikely that the 31,999,998 others are also lazy on the basis of just two. Hasty generalization is the basis for a whole lot of stereotypes and bias and racism. An ad hominem attack is Latin meaning against the person, ad meaning against, and hominem meaning person. Homo sapiens comes from one of the same roots. So Alan says 1 + 1 = 2, and Bill says, Alan is an idiot, don't believe him. Bill is not arguing against what Alan said. He's not tearing apart that argument using critical thinking. He's attacking Alan and trying to get you to ignore what Alan said by coloring your perspective of who Alan is. Alan's an idiot, don't believe him. That's not an argument against his claim. It's an argument against the person, and it's basically used to distract people from the information that you're analyzing. A straw man argument, the logical fallacy of the straw man comes from a term used for what ancient militaries used to use for practicing. They would build men of straw, and they would do it for one purpose, and that was to tear them apart. They'd take target practice, they'd ride on their horse and use a sword to chop them to pieces. It's easier than using real people, I suppose. So what a straw man argument is, it's like a fake argument. It's a misrepresentation of another person's claim in order to create an artificial position that you can then attack and refute and say is wrong. So you're basically putting words in the mouth of the party that you're arguing against. An example is if Alan says we need to do a spring cleaning, Bill could say, why do we have to clean all the time? That's a straw man argument because Alan didn't say that we have to clean all the time. He said we have to do a spring cleaning, which is usually once a year in the spring. It seems like Bill is basically doesn't want to clean, so instead of cleaning once a year, you'll end up cleaning never. He basically mischaracterized the argument so it could create an appeal to people who maybe don't want to clean all that much either. Another example would be as if Alan said, we need to adjust our expenditures to avoid going deeper into debt. And then Bill's response is, some say that we can't do what's necessary to be successful. I say we can. Alan didn't say that we can't do what's necessary. He just said we don't want to spend a lot of money. But Bill basically put words in Alan's mouth, and instead of arguing against what Alan said, he argued against this fictitious argument that he created and attributed to Alan, and then argued against that. It's just a way to distract people from the actual facts. Circular reasoning is a lot like if you use Excel and you get that when you make a mistake in the formula and it tells you that you have a circular reference. It basically, you can't add up two cells in Excel without having two separate cells. If you add one cell and do it times itself, it's going to come back and say you have a circular reference. In the old days, you used to get that paper clip that would pop up and say you made a mistake. So for an example of circular reasoning, it's basically a premise that presupposes a conclusion. If you ever heard a little kid, when you ask them why they did something and they say because, and because why, you just go around in circles. That's why it's called circular reason. There really isn't a reason for it. Somebody just wanted to do it. So the example here would be Alan says, I like chocolate ice cream. Bill says, why? Alan says, because it's my favorite. Bill says, why is it your favorite? Alan says, because I like chocolate ice cream. This is maybe not the best example because taste for food is very subjective and personal, but I think you get the idea. You just don't really have a reason for it, you just wanted to do it. A false equivalence is when you compare one thing. Analogies, or using something that is analogous or comparable to something else, is often quite useful if those things actually are similar. When you compare apples to oranges, which is kind of the basis of what a false equivalent is, that would be a problem. A year or two ago, there was a meme that was floating around on Twitter. It was about the Syrian war and the refugees that were leaving Syria. And the meme said, if you had a bowl of Skittles and I told you just 3 would kill you, would you take a handful? And the answer to that was, that's our Syrian refugee problem. The idea being, if you let in a bunch of refugees and some of them happen to be terrorists, it's too risky to let anybody else in. This is a false equivalence for a number of reasons. The first being, based on what Wrigley, which owns Skittles, their PR department actually got in the middle of this and they had to release a comment and they said, Skittles are candy, refugees are people. That's obviously why it's a false equivalence. They also went on to say that we don't feel it's an appropriate analogy. We will respectfully refrain from further commentary as anything we say could be misinterpreted as marketing. Their PR director or their communications director earned their money that day because they needed to come out and say something, but they didn't want to necessarily look like they were taking advantage of the situation to sell their product. Just like they said, Skittles are candy, refugees are people. Comparing one to the other doesn't make an awful lot of sense. The other thing is, if you really look at the statistics, from 1975 to 2015, the chances of 3 Americans being killed by a terrorist carried out by someone born outside the United States is 1 in 3.6 billion. Billion with a B, which is 1,000 times more than a million. If you had to eat 3.6 billion Skittles, for example, you'd have to eat a handful every second, which amounts to 86,400 handfuls per day for 114 years. So the non-poisonous Skittles would have killed you probably within an hour if you ate that many. That's another reason why it's a false equivalence, because you're comparing people to candy, which is obviously not accurate. But you're comparing the statistics of 3 in 20 when it's actually 1 in 3.6 billion, which it's such a different scale that it's not even applicable. One other thing that we want to talk about before we get into decision making is the idea of parsimony. Parsimony is a nice SAT word. Parsimonious means to be cheap, basically. So the idea behind parsimony is economy, efficiency. You want to make a decision or come up with a solution to a problem that is the least complicated, because if it's the least complicated, it's more likely to work. There are fewer things that could potentially go wrong. It has to be complicated enough that it actually addresses the problem. It can't be so simple that it doesn't do anything. At this point, I would want you to look at the videos, one for the mousetrap from your syllabus. That video is based on the concept of what is known as a Rube Goldberg machine. Rube Goldberg was an old cartoonist who used to make these ridiculous contraptions, and he would publish them, and he would take something very simple like a mousetrap or an alarm clock, and he would make it incredibly complicated. And in fact, now engineering students engage in what are known as Rube Goldberg machine competitions. And if you go on YouTube, like the video that I gave you, the one that I gave you is about a mousetrap, and it just basically shows you how complicated a mousetrap could be. So if you saw that video, you noticed how many things had to happen for the mousetrap to work. By the time the trap actually fell on the toy mouse in that video, there was so much noise going on and so many other things, the mouse probably would have left. Do you think that there might be a more efficient way to catch a mouse? So the idea is if you have something that is simple and yet effective, that's what you want to go with. And when you're trying to explain a problem or come up to a solution to a problem, if you have a really complicated process that takes 20 steps and you have to train your employees, just like that mousetrap, there's a lot of things that could go wrong. The guy who made that video must have had to spend, I don't know how many hours making it. I don't know how many times they had to film it before it worked the right way. But before we go forward again, in the interest of parsimony, I want you to watch the time traveler video, which is also linked in your syllabus. So go ahead and pause this video, and then after you watch the other video, you can come back. When I show that video in class, I usually edit it down to just 2 or 3 minutes. I know it's a little bit long, but kind of interesting anyway. So that video was initially released about 10 years ago. It was movie footage from a film that premiered in 1928. It had been viewed several million times right away. It's almost 7 million views so far today. The guy, George Clark, he's making assumptions, like we said before. He doesn't know for sure. He's just making his best guesses. He said that she's talking into a device. He said it's not an ear trumpet. He also said that nobody can explain it, because he asked all of his friends and they didn't know. Kind of nonsensically, he says it's not a radio, and he says it can't be a transistor radio because they weren't small enough in 1928. But even though it's still 1928, he says it's a cell phone. And because they didn't have cell phones at that time, the only thing it could possibly be is someone from the modern era going back in time and speaking on a cell phone. So he looked at that video, he made these assumptions, it kind of backed him into a corner. Because he made those assumptions and one led to the other, now he's left with saying that this is an old woman who's time traveling. What are the problems with this? Well, first of all, it's a very small clip. It's completely out of context. There's no sound, there's no witnesses, there's no additional information. To be honest with you, everybody that was involved with it is dead. Everybody who knew what was going on with it is dead. Everybody who filmed it, everybody who appeared in it, it's almost 100 years ago, 92 years ago. We may never know what was going on there based on the evidence that's available to us, and that's okay. It's when you jump to these conclusions and make assumptions without proof that you may end up having some problems. I want to know also, is his interpretation of what's going on affected by his knowledge of the current day? When you see somebody walking around with their head to their head, maybe 5 years ago you would think they were on a cell phone. A lot of people have the Bluetooth microphones now, so when that video came out, he didn't know about Bluetooth probably, or at least to the extent that it is now. She would have just been walking down the street talking out loud. Maybe you would have thought she was crazy, which is what I do today when I see people on Bluetooth half the time. But if you saw somebody walking around with something to their head in the 1960s, and you were in the 1960s, you would have thought it was a transistor radio. He doesn't know what life was like in 1928, so his ignorance of history of that time also limits his interpretation and could lead to some erroneous assumptions. Some technical questions come up. The way cell phones work is that they are constantly in communication with cell phone towers. They have to use what is known as triangulation. If you ever see the light on your phone blinking in the nighttime, that's because it's talking to the cell phone tower. So when you move, it'll say that it's moving and it can go to the next cell phone tower so your call doesn't drop. Since there were no cell phones in 1928, there are also no cell phone towers. Maybe it's a communication device, but it's not a cell phone. I'm also not a physicist, but based on my understanding from people like Einstein and the like, it is impossible to go back in time. If it were feasible, it would be an unbelievably advanced technological society or civilization that would be able to do it. If you're that advanced that you could travel back in time, why would you be using a cell phone? We can't travel back in time, and we have cell phones now. And as I said, you don't usually walk around with your phone glued to your head anymore because of Bluetooth. So why would she be talking on a cell phone? Why would she also use advanced technology in public? If she was from the future, she would know that people would think it was weird and she might get caught. So looking back at what parsimony is, less is more is kind of the idea behind it. The simplest answer is usually the best. His answer is pretty complicated. Is there a more likely or simple answer that could be more likely to be true? Well, let's look at his motivation. The guy who made the video is a film producer. And during the video, he pitched his movies, he pitched his film festival, he pitched the website, and he got over 5 million views within a month. I didn't know who the guy was. I know who he is now. He might not even believe it. He could have just published it in order to get all the views so people would start buying his movies. This is a picture of an ear trumpet. He said it's not an ear trumpet, but an ear trumpet is in the old days. They had these conically shaped things that would terminate in your ear, and it basically serves to amplify sound. This is a compact ear trumpet, and this is a photograph of Vaughan Williams, a British composer in 1924, using a compact ear trumpet. Siemens also makes electronic hearing aids, and I went to their website, and it took about 30 seconds to find their history, and in 1924, they created a patent, or they patented the technology to create an electronic hearing aid. And you would walk around with a battery pack and you'd have a piece that would hold up to your ear to amplify the sound. And that's what it looked like when you were using them. So I don't know what this woman is doing. It might be gloves in her hand. She could have been scratching her head. She could have been yelling at the man who walked ahead of her. She could have been talking to herself. I don't know what it is. I'm pretty sure it's not a time traveler talking on a cell phone. And the odds of it being a time traveler talking on a cell phone is very slim. So let's move forward to decision making. If you're going to use critical thinking, the idea would be using critical thinking to get you a good decision. A good decision is open, logical, rational, reasonable, based on accurate information, and it's something that you can explain. If somebody asks you to explain a decision and you can't tell them, chances are you really didn't think it through. You're just making a guess. And, guesses sometimes work. You can flip a coin and say heads or tails, and you'll be right half the time. But why would you want to base your career to chance? You want to use decisions or use critical thinking and use decisions that are on the basis of that in order to minimize your possibility of making an error. You are going to make errors. But if you can make an error only 5% of the time instead of 20% of the time, and your competition for your promotion or in your business make mistakes more often than you because they're not using reasonable or critical thinking, then go ahead and use critical thinking. It'll make you a better employee. It'll make you a better manager. One of the first things that you should do is ask questions. Questions should be targeted, succinct, and relevant. If you ask bad questions, you'll get bad information and then make bad decisions. You want to stay away from leading questions. That is a question that suggests an answer. For example, you don't really want to do that, do you? That ends in a question mark, so it is a question, but it's actually more of a threat. If somebody tells you that, they're telling you not to do it. They're not really asking you what you would like to do. Another thing is a loaded question where you build in an accusation into the question, such as, when did you stop stealing from the office? How would you answer that? Yesterday? I haven't been stealing from the office. It's basically more of an attack rather than a question. If there are supplies missing from the office, you want to ask questions and not make accusations so you can get some information to figure out what's going on. The types of questions that you should ask are your basic journalism questions. Who, what, when, where, why, how. Who, what people are involved, what relevant parties and stakeholders. What are we talking about? What are the elements? What are the issues? Where is it occurring? When is it happening? When do we need to have a decision? Why are we doing something? Why are we not doing something? And how could we do something to address it? What are our options? What are our possible solutions? You ask all of these open-ended questions to people who know what they're talking about. They'll give you some good information back. And then you can address that information, look through it critically, and come up with some solutions. When you're asking questions to try to get a solution to a problem, keep in mind that there may only be one right or one wrong answer. There could be a lot of possible right or wrong answers. You may ask a question of someone that you perceive to be an expert, and they may give you the wrong answer. Sometimes they may give you the wrong answer on purpose, which is a whole other category. And there may also be no answer. You know, what was that woman talking into in her hand? I don't know. And there may never be an answer. So these types of things could come up, and you need to be aware of that. When you're desperate to find an answer, just be aware that there may not be one. You'll have to maybe recategorize the issue and try to address some other items to try to mitigate the problem that's arising. You also want to collect as much information as possible if it's something that you're not very familiar with. It's a recursive process, meaning that you come back to it. A lot of times I'll look into something and I'll learn a little bit about it, and then I'll have a whole bunch of new questions once I understand the beginning, and I have to keep going back and expanding my knowledge. You need to collect as much information as you need to make a reasonably good decision. You don't have to become an expert, but you need to know more than nothing. So somewhere between nothing and expertise, you need to be conversant in what's going on and understand the ramifications of the issues that are being involved. Then you can make a decision. The nature of information is important, and observation can sometimes be deceiving. You may think things like common sense and what you saw are good information, but I'd like you to pause this video and then watch two other videos on YouTube that are linked. One is titled Observation Number 1, and the other is Observation Number 2. Watch them both. They're only a couple of minutes each, and then come back. Interestingly enough, these were commercials in the United Kingdom to get people to pay attention to bicycle riders so that they don't get run over. It's kind of an interesting way to do it. The first video, which was the murder whodunit, there were a whole lot of changes in there. I think there was something like 21 or 27 changes. I didn't notice it the first time around. The detective had a different coat on. The dead body was different. The clock was different. The suit of armor and the bear, the paintings, the flowers. When they go back to the longer view, you can see that they changed all of that. You didn't know what to look for, so a lot of you may not have seen anything. The second video, they told you what to look for. And because a lot of you probably focused on counting how many passes were made, I believe there were 13, you didn't see the moonwalking bear. And about 75% don't see it. And there's a whole lot of different versions of this video that have been used in psychology classes for decades. So don't be surprised if you didn't catch any of the changes or only one or two of the changes in the first video, and if you missed the bear in the second video entirely. There's no great lesson to be learned here other than to understand how fallible you are. You don't have to accept everything at face value, and you shouldn't look at something so narrowly that you don't see the rest of what's going on. When you're making a decision, you also want to do what you can to mitigate bias. Bias is basically a preference for a particular view or outcome that interferes with impartiality and results in prejudice or a prejudiced outcome. Biases warp facts and distort arguments. They can taint data. If you have uncontrolled biases, you lead to uncontrolled or unsupported conclusions. And it's almost impossible to eliminate bias because you probably are biased in certain things, and you may even admit it. You're probably also biased for certain things, and you don't even know that you are. You have to have it kind of proven to you. You should just assume that you may have some level of bias. If you can do something close to the scientific method where you remove yourself or your biases from the process to the extent possible, you can come up with a more true determination. The confirmation bias is one of dozens of biases that you could look up. Basically, if someone wants something to be true, they will only look for information that confirms their position, instead of looking at information that contradicts it. So oftentimes people will downplay negative information. They will overstate the positive information that supports their findings or their preferred solution. And it's not really critical thinking at all. Jack Welch, the former CEO of General Electric, who happens to be from Salem, Massachusetts, and I believe he attended the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, he said that the most important quality of leadership is the ability to see the world the way it is, not the way you wish it were. Seeing things the way you wish it were leads to the confirmation bias, because then you just ignore evidence to the contrary, what you want. We need to talk about numbers for a little bit. Numeric information is important. If you're in business, you'll be dealing with numbers quite a lot. But the scope of numbers can be kind of confusing from time to time. So if you think about what you could buy with $1, which isn't much, and compare that to what you could buy with $1,000, most of you have probably been in the position where you've spent either $1 or $1,000 or somewhere in between. The difference between $1 and $1,000 is the same difference in terms of the ratio as there is between $1,000 and $1 million. A million is 1,000 times more than 1,000. A billion is 1,000 times more than a million. A trillion is 1,000 times more than a billion. This is not simply regular growth. This is known as exponential growth. You're talking about a factor of 1,000. When somebody says $1 million and then you hear somebody say $1 billion, you may just think, well, that's a lot of money. But a billion is 1,000 times more. A trillion is 1,000,000 times more than a million, excuse me. So you're talking about enormous scale in terms of numbers. If you think about the size of an inch, maybe you hold your fingers apart, you can probably figure it out, or look at a ruler. 1,000 inches is about a basketball court. What about 1,000,000 inches? 1,000,000 inches would be a trip from Boston to Reading, Massachusetts, Natick, or Sharon. It's basically almost a marathon. 1,000,000,000 inches, how far would that be? 3 round trips from Boston to Los Angeles. Those are round trips. From Boston to LA and back, to LA and back, to LA and back. That's 1,000,000,000 inches. 1,000,000,000,000 inches is 1,000 times more than that. So that would be 33 round trips to the moon, or 635 times around the equator. Our current deficit this year is about $1 billion. And when the deficit continues year after year, the aggregate of all of those deficits goes into what's known as the debt. The public debt of the United States is over $20 trillion. So just in terms of scale, the amount of money that the government is now borrowing to handle the pandemic and the unemployment and everything that's coming from it is somewhere around $3.5 trillion. So it's an enormous amount of money. It's almost inconceivable or incomprehensible to understand how much it is. When you're talking about numbers, you also have to be aware of what statistics are and what sample sizes are. Statistical samples are when you only count a few. We're in a political season, so they talk about polls. They'll say in a poll of 1,000 or 2,000 people, 45% like this candidate, 35% like that candidate, the rest are undecided. What they do is they're trying to figure out what the entire country thinks, but they can't ask the entire country, so they only ask a portion, a sample. There's going to be bias in there because you're not asking the entire country, you're only asking a few. If you have a sample size that is too small, the bias would be so great that it's almost not worth it. So small sample sizes are a problem in determining accuracy because when you extrapolate the results, it may not be indicative of what the full universe of the people or the things that you're counting would indicate. Flawed questions that you ask can also taint things like polls and can skew the data. And people use statistics quite often to manipulate arguments for others. Mark Twain and Benjamin Disraeli from the UK, they're both attributed with a famous quote, there are 3 kinds of lies. Lies, damned lies, and statistics. And the idea is that a lot of people cherry pick statistics and they do confirmation bias and some other things. And they say, here's the proof. And they have statistics that are taken out of context or they're flawed. I want you to imagine a big box with 1,000 plastic balls in it. 899 are blue, that means 89.9% are blue. 100 are red, that's 10%. And 1 is yellow, that is 0.1%. You take 3 balls at random, it turns out that there's 2 red and 1 blue. From that, you would extrapolate from that sample size that 66% of the balls are red and 33% are blue. But we already know it's almost 90% are blue. So your small sample size is a problem. If you took 50 balls, you would get a better representation, assuming the balls are all mixed up randomly. If you did that, you would get a reasonable estimate, but if you don't count all 1,000 balls, it's going to be inexact. So for example, if in the 50 that you sampled, the yellow ball happened to be in there, 1 out of 50 is 2%. So you would say that there was 2% of the balls were yellow, when in fact it's 0.1%. So you come up with a factor of 20 wrong. You've overestimated it. If you took 500 balls and you never picked up that yellow ball, it's going to come back as 0. So there's a risk when you use a sample. The bigger the sample, the better it is. You just have to look at statistical sampling and come to the conclusion that it is useful, because otherwise you'd be sitting there counting 1,000 of these plastic balls, which nobody wants to do. I'd lose count after 30 or 40. But you can use it as a tool. You just need to be aware that it is a flawed tool and it is not accurate completely. Numbers can be hard to determine, especially when they're written in language. Here's a quote. These are all from newspapers that I found a few years ago. The House, meaning the legislature, is considering raising the sales tax 1% from 5% to 6%. The problem is, if you raise the sales tax from 5% to 6%, that is not a 1% increase. That is a 20% increase. If you've got 5, 1 out of 5 is 20%. 5 plus 1 is 6. That's a 20% increase. A 1% increase would only be 5.05%. So again, talking about headlines at the beginning of this lecture, when people want you to think one thing or the other, they may purposely misunderstand or misrepresent what the percentages are or what the numbers are. Here, they may have just made a mistake. But 5% to 6% is not a single percent increase. It is a 20% increase. This happened a few years ago when the state was thinking about raising the sales tax. And ironically, they didn't raise it from 5% to 6%. They raised it to 6.25%. They actually raised it more. Here's another example. Battling Hunger, a food pantry, said it delivered 110,000 tons of food to Detroit. The food was delivered to help residents there overcome the effects of a severe economic slump, particularly in the automobile industry. 110,000 tons of food. A ton is 2,000 pounds. 110,000 tons is 220 million pounds of food. At the time, Detroit's population was about 900,000. It's actually much less now. People have left because the economy was so bad. 220 million pounds divided by 919,000 is 240 pounds of food for every resident on Thanksgiving. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that it was not 110,000 tons of food. It was 110 tons, which is 220,000 pounds of food, rather than 220 million pounds of food. So you have to look at this as a manager, as a business person. When people give you information like this, if it looks like it might be a little bit off, you need to look at that information and figure out what they're actually trying to say. And if there's a mistake, you need to catch it, because if you went on the record as paying for 110,000 tons of food, that's going to be a big problem for you. We need to understand the difference between objective and subjective. Objective is basically fact. Subjective is opinion. You've probably heard these terms quite often. You may not understand the nuance between them. Objective information, you can observe it, you can count it, you can describe it, you can ask different people and they'll tell you the same thing. You can test with it and get the same results, and you can reproduce those tests. Subjective information is intangible, you can't touch it. It usually comes from personal judgment and may be based on assumptions, beliefs, rumors, suspicion, and it can vary from person to person. The best example that I can give for you to explain the difference between objective and subjective is to imagine a day when you go outside. Maybe you're going to the beach or something. Imagine what 50 degrees feels like, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Now imagine it's 50 degrees in January and it's 50 degrees in July. What do you say when it's 50 degrees in January? Probably say it's pretty warm out. What do you say when it's 50 degrees in July? You may say it's kind of cold out. Whether you think it's hot or cold is totally subjective. When you look at the thermometer, it's 50 degrees. 50 degrees in January, 50 degrees in July. Objectively, it is the same temperature, but your opinion of it may differ depending on the circumstance. When you're trying to make a decision and do critical thinking, you want to get as much objective information as possible and eliminate the subjective. You can ask people for their information or for their opinion, but you want the information that you're making a decision on to be objective. You also look at the nature of information. So information should be clear. If you don't understand something, you can't do anything with it. The information should also be accurate. Is it true? Can you verify or corroborate it? Can you prove that it's true or get other people to judge that it is true? The problem is that you can have a statement that is clear but be inaccurate. So if I said most dogs weigh more than 300 pounds, that's clear enough that you know what I'm saying, but it's not accurate. Precision is also important. Is the information that you're getting specific? Are there assumed details? The idea here is that a statement could be clear and accurate, but it might not be precise. I could tell you that my dog is overweight. That's clear. You understand what I'm saying. Assume I have a fat dog. That's true too. What are you going to do with that information? If I told you my dog was 4 pounds overweight, and you're the vet, you could tell me, he needs to get exercise, he needs to go on a special diet, this is what you need to do. The idea, though, if you want to take actionable information, it has to be something that you can understand, it has to be clear, it has to be accurate, and it has to be precise and relevant to what you're trying to make the decision about. Language is important when dealing with critical thinking as well. There are a few terms that I want to go over. One of them is called weasel words. It's not a formal term, but a weasel is a little rodent that's kind of hard to catch. Weasel words are words that people use when they don't want to be held accountable. Warning signs of weasel words or examples, some people say. When someone says, some people are saying, who's saying it? Are you just making it up? You may want to just invent people to make it sound like you have some level of authority. Whenever you hear someone say, people are saying, or some people say, or people say this, your first question should be, who said that? And it's probably nobody. When people say somewhat, approximately, typically, generally, apparently, any of these words that end in ly for some reason seem to be weasel words. If somebody said, what's the temperature out there today? It's approximately 50 degrees. Is it 60 degrees or is it 40 degrees? Because there is kind of a difference. That's a way for me to say, I don't really know, and I don't want you to hold me accountable for it. Practically, virtually, nearly, up to, if you have a sale up to 5% off, or nearly everything's on sale, or virtually everything is on sale, what you probably have is, if it's up to 20% off, or nearly everything is up to 20% off, you probably have one item in the store that's 20% off and everything else is the regular price. Weasel words are basically a way to mask reality. Euphemisms are kind of similar, but they're not trying to weasel your way out of a situation. They're trying to obscure the meaning of what's going on and replace it with another word. Sometimes euphemisms are okay. If you go to a funeral or a wake, you'll tell someone, I'm sorry for your loss. Loss is a euphemism for someone dying. You don't necessarily want to go in and say, hey, I'm sorry your dad is dead. You try to soften it sometimes by using a euphemism. I'm sorry that your father passed. I'm sorry for your loss. That's okay. But when you're in business and you're asking your accountants and your financial people to tell you how much money you made, well, we didn't have as quite a good a year as we thought we were going to have. I just want to know what's actually going on. I don't need to hear any other terminology for it. So I'm going to give you an example. The local Board of Education sought to change the classification of failing schools from underperforming to priority. The worst schools, now known as chronically underperforming, would be changed to priority 1. This was out of a newspaper article I read a few years ago. The problem here is underperforming, which is what they used to be called, is already a euphemism for bad. It's a bad school. They're not doing particularly well. And now they've replaced bad or failing with underperforming, and now they're calling them a priority school. If I told you my kid goes to a priority school, what would you think it was? Would you know that it was a terrible school? Probably not. And they do that on purpose because they try to mask the true meaning of what's going on. One of the funny things about it, and there's been if you look up George Carlin on euphemisms, he was a comedian who passed away a few years ago, or died, I suppose. He passed away a few years ago. And he did a whole thing about how language has really weakened meaning. When you have a euphemism that everybody figures out, you usually have to invent a new euphemism to cover it. Here's another one. This is when the old pandemic, the swine flu, the H1N1 pandemic came around about 10 years ago. They asked someone in Michigan at the health department if there would be an availability issue regarding the vaccine. And the response was, we've not heard that there's going to be a shortage, but there will be a delay in production capacity. Well, a delay in production capacity means that you're going to have a shortage. They didn't want to say that they had a shortage, but they said, oh, there'll just be a delay in production capacity. But if you want a vaccine and there's a delay in production capacity, they're not going to have a vaccine for you. So that's a shortage. They're just trying to not admit that there's a problem. Look for euphemisms. Your antenna should go up. When people start using colorful expressions to explain something, just get them to cut right through it and tell you what's going on. Some examples of euphemisms: economically disadvantaged, that means poor. A mobile home community is a trailer park. Food insecurity, this is a real term from the federal government. That's what they say if you're hungry, you have food insecurity. A military action is a war. Lives lost means people who are killed. A sanitary landfill, it's not very sanitary because it's a dump. Ill-advised is bad. Pre-owned, this one drives me crazy. Pre-owned is used. You can buy a pre-owned car. Guess what? It's still used. Legally, I think that there's an issue with it that I take some umbrage with. You could buy a car and own it and never use it. And I could sell it to you. It could be a collector car. I could have a 1957 Ford Thunderbird that's never been driven. That would be worth a fortune. It is owned, and I would sell it to you as pre-owned. But if I drove it, it's used. Gaming. We have gambling in Massachusetts, but the commission that regulates them is the Massachusetts Gaming Commission. I guess gaming sounds like it's more fun, and gambling sounds like it's a vice. And then the last one was, does anybody rest in a restroom? I mentioned this at work a few years ago when I was teaching this class, and someone said yes. Some people do. But it's a bathroom, which is also not really what it is. It's a toilet. It is what it is, but most people call it a restroom or the facilities to be nice. You have to look for undefined terms. Sometimes people say things like, we took all appropriate action. That doesn't mean anything unless they tell you what action they took. What did you do? We took appropriate action. That quote, we took all appropriate action, is what the response was made by the Springfield School District after a 10-year-old boy hung himself after being bullied for being gay. And when they said, why did you let this happen? What did you do to prevent it? Their answer was, we took all appropriate action. That doesn't say anything. That's a great lawyer answer because you don't want to admit anything. But if you're in business and you're trying to get to the bottom of a problem to become more profitable, you don't want your managers to say, we did what was appropriate. You want them to tell you what they actually did. People may misrepresent and take information out of context too. So just be aware that, if they quote one sentence out of a 400-page document, that they may be cherry picking, as they say. They may be only giving you some of the information, or they just may be outright lying. It's always good to get information from one source and then back it up by going to another to make sure that it's accurate. If you're collecting information from the internet, it's also very important to understand where that is coming from. There is a mountain of stuff on the internet that is incredibly valuable. There's probably 3 times as much stuff that is totally bogus. Anybody who wants to get a website can do it for just a few bucks a month. And you can basically put up anything you want that hasn't been vetted or peer reviewed or anything else. If you go online and you look for information, you need to know where you're going. Who is the source? What is the source? Is it a personal website? Is it an organization? Is it a government? Do you know who the author was? Are they using good grammar? Or are they spelling things correctly? A lot of times you'll go to like Congress, and some of them are .com, .org, .net. Congress.gov is the only one that's actually Congress. There are a lot of other spoof sites that make it look like it. There's a ton of information on Twitter, all these memes, things on Facebook, the deep state, all this stuff. You need to get proof for it. Just because it appears on the internet doesn't mean that it's true, and you need to know what the source is before you decide to believe that anything is accurate. Experts are very useful because if you're trying to make a decision and you don't know how to do something, if you can find an expert, you have to pay them for it, but it'll be better in the long run than you learning and taking all the time to figure out how to become an expert yourself, or making a decision that could cost you a lot of money. So find an expert that can come in and give you some consultation. Hopefully you can figure it out. So an expert is somebody with a high degree of knowledge in a given field. They have years of training, they can pinpoint a problem, and they can come up with a solution. You can go to WebMD if you're not feeling that great, but go to the doctor. They know what they're dealing with. They can probably come up with a better answer. The problem with experts is you have to make sure that you're dealing with somebody who is actually an expert. Just because somebody says, trust me, I'm an expert, that doesn't mean that they are. In a tactful manner, you should be able to say, oh, tell me about your experience. Where did you go to school? Where have you published material? What kind of jobs have you had? Experience is also not the same as expertise. When you hear somebody say, listen, I've been doing this for 20 years, that's impressive, but they may have been doing it badly for 20 years. That doesn't mean that you're an expert. The problem with experts, the true experts, is that they may become overconfident sometimes. They become successful because they did all the critical thinking that they're supposed to, but then they just start taking the easy way out, and then they say, trust me, I'm an expert, and they don't do the work that they're supposed to do in order to come to the conclusion. And when they become overconfident, it leads to closed minds, and then they look at themselves as a little bit superior. The other thing is we want to believe experts, because if we don't know something, we can take some type of solace in an expert telling us, hey, trust me, this is the way it's going to fix the problem. You question your own understanding and rank. You can't know anything or everything. You trust other people to be able to take care of it. And there's a level of comfort by having someone tell you this is how to fix it, and you want to trust them. The problem with experts specifically is when it comes to predictions. Predictions are necessary sometimes, like I said before about a budget. You may have to project into the future. But Philip Tetlock is a Berkeley psychologist at the University of California. He found through a study of over 30 years of expert predictions that expert predictions reported in the news are no more accurate than predictions made by anybody. Many are worse than could be expected by chance, and almost inconceivably, the more famous an expert is, the worse they were at making predictions. If you think about it, it's not that confusing because nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. Nobody knew that the last economy was going to collapse in 2008 and 9. Nobody knew that there was going to be a pandemic. People thought that there might be a pandemic, but you couldn't say that it was going to come on whatever particular date. People just do the best that they can when things happen. Because no one has a crystal ball or a time machine, that woman who supposedly was talking on a cell phone, regardless, you're not going to be able to know what's going to happen in the future because there's too many variables. This is an example of the 2008 NBA Finals. These people are all former players, coaches. They work for ESPN. They get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. They basically live basketball. And in a 7-game series, they said who's going to win. And 9 out of the 10 picked the Lakers. And only one of them picked the Celtics, and he got the number of games wrong because the Celtics won in 6 games. These are the experts. Didn't really work out the way that they had predicted. And this is not that uncommon. In the NHL, they've had experts make their picks for the Stanley Cup championship. They actually used an octopus at an aquarium, go into the tank and pick the winner, and the octopus won. So that doesn't mean that you shouldn't pay attention to experts. They are experts for a reason. They may know less than they claim to know, but that doesn't mean that they don't know anything or that they don't know more than you. They do bring a great deal of knowledge. You should question them like anybody else, and they should be able to justify their answer. They have to have more than a gut feeling. Otherwise, they're throwing out all their skills and ignoring critical thinking, and then they're just doing something based on bias. Decision factors are important. We talked about risk before. It's important to measure the probability and impact of risk and be able to address that. I'm not going to go too much into it for the purposes of this class, but people often are very bad at assessing risk. There are people who are afraid to fly. They like to drive instead because they feel more in control. The lifetime risk of dying in a plane crash is 1 in 5,000 when you multiply it out for the average life expectancy. The average lifetime risk of dying in a car accident is 1 in 83. So you are much safer getting in an airplane, whether you're scared of airplanes or not. There was a thing a few years ago about shark attacks. They called it the Summer of the Shark. There was a shark attack, I think, not too long ago. As the water gets warmer off the Cape, there'll be shark sightings and they'll close beaches and everybody will freak out about it. There's 7 billion people in the world. About 5 in the entire planet are killed by shark attacks every year. Worldwide, you are about 15 times more likely to die from having a coconut fall out of a tree and hit you in the head. So people, oh my God, there's a shark in the water, I'm not going to go swimming. They don't go swimming because 5 people out of 7 billion get attacked. 3,300 Americans drown every year. So they'll go into a lake where they think it's safer, but it's just a miscalculation or a misunderstanding or appreciation of the numbers. This is related to the scope of numbers that we were talking to before as well. When you're coming up after you've done your critical thinking and you've looked at all of the information, you need to come up with a decision. So you want to look at your potential solutions. You want to use information to develop arguments for a solution, and you want to have a few alternatives, because if you have one alternative, if you just have one solution and it doesn't work, where are you going to go? If you've got a number of solutions and you pick the best one, chances are that's going to be a better solution because, survival of the fittest. And then if it doesn't work, then you have a plan B and a plan C and a plan E. You may even be able to combine some aspects of it and be creative to come up with better solutions. So if you have a better solution, if you have more possible solutions, you usually get a better decision in the long run. The first thing that you could do when you're trying to make a decision is look at any previous decisions that were done and whether you can use a true equivalent analogy. Anytime you can borrow from somebody else in your organization, it can save time. If you have to purchase a computer system or something else, and somebody did that just a couple of years ago, you could look at that material to help you out instead of reinventing everything from scratch. The best thing, and we're going to talk about this in organizational behavior later, is the idea of having controlled conflict. It's important to be able to have people argue, not ad hominem, or insulting people, but to argue about the basis of a decision, the merit of a decision that you're trying to make. You may have situations where everybody's on the same page and there's never any conflict. That can actually be bad, and we'll talk about that later when we review what a devil's advocate is. The devil's advocate is there to say, maybe this isn't a good idea, and they question the common assessment or the common sense of what everybody's trying to go with. By having somebody say, is this really a good idea? It makes people look back, and sometimes you can catch a problem before it actually gets implemented. So controlled conflict, you are able to foster disagreement, but not let it get out of hand. No ad hominem attacks. You can allow criticism of the ideas, but not the people. If you have ad hominem attacks, you have bruised egos, defensive posturing, petty bickering, and then people don't talk to each other, and you're not going to be getting a solution of any kind at that point. So the implications of decisions are important as well. I think that's going to wrap it up for critical thinking. We're going to pick up with chapter 8 and 1 during the next session. So this is not going to be on the exam, but we will come back to some of the things that we talked about in this video throughout the rest of the semester, because a lot of organizational behavior is based on interpreting information and making decisions about how to address it. And I think that this is a pretty strong basis for being able to move forward. Thank you.